Augustine framed the early response of the church to suicide by saying that suicide violates the sixth commandment. What's the sixth commandment? Shalt not murder. And is an assault on the image of God, the imago Dei. He said further that suicide is a sin with no possibility of repentance. And he described suicide as a cowardly act. Aquinas, some years later, argued further, suicide is unnatural. It goes against the will to survive. And furthermore, he said suicide is an offense against the whole community because it affects so many people. So it's wrong to do it because of the effect it has on other people. And he said, suicide usurps God's power and authority over life and death. It is the ultimate act of autonomy. On the surface, suicide seems to be about death. Because if a suicidal subject succeeds, they will what? They will die. But that's on the surface. If we dig deeper, suicide is really about life and about dissatisfaction with living. The suicidal subject wants something to change, but they don't know how, or they can't effect the change that's needed. The origins of suicide, therefore, go back to Genesis chapters 1 to 3. What happens in those chapters? 1 and 2. Chapter 1, you have the account. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Chapter 2 focuses in on the creation of man and woman. Man is made in God's image, but man is not God. There's a clear creator-creature distinction. In Genesis chapter 3, we have the temptation of Eve and Adam. And what is the temptation? I take it literally. I believe that there indeed was a fruit that they were told not to eat. But it's more than the fruit. What was the temptation? You will be like God. The temptation was, if I eat of this fruit, the serpent told Eve, you'll be like God. You'll be able to determine for yourself true and false, right and wrong. And Eve looked at the fruit. She considered it. It looked nice. It looked like it was edible. And it had all these benefits, according to the serpent. And she ate, and she gave to her husband. We call that the fall. And as a consequence of the fall, death passed upon Adam and all of Adam's posterity, both spiritual death, alienation from God, and physical death. They began that day to deteriorate, to die. And the question, the ultimate question of all time is, are you God? Who's in charge? Who is sovereign? Do you have sovereignty, or does God have sovereignty? Psychiatrist Thomas Ass says that a man's life belongs to himself. Hence, he has a right to take his own life. That is, to commit suicide. John Ling, in the United Kingdom, says that suicide is a personal assault against the sovereignty of God in all the affairs of human life. The suicide declares that she has a sovereign rule over her life and a sovereign reign over her death. Neither of which is true. Our lives belong to God. There is no God besides me, he says. I put to death and I bring to life. Are there suicides in the Bible? Yes, there are. I've summarized them here. There's the suicide of Abimelech in Judges chapter 9. Abimelech was in the process of assaulting the tower in Thebez when a woman dropped a millstone from the top of the tower and it struck him on his head. Mortally wounded. he hurriedly called to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that they can't say, 'A woman killed him.' So his servant ran him through, and he died." A couple questions. Is this intentional? Yes. Is there a reason? Yes. What's the reason? Pride. So they can't say, "A woman killed him. You kill me." Samson in Judges 16. You remember this, where Samson is captured and he pulls down the pillars upon himself and the Philistines. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. This is not so much, sometimes it's treated as a suicide, sometimes it's not treated as a suicide. I think it's not so much a suicide as it is a self-sacrifice on behalf of his kinsmen. He brings ruin to their enemies. Saul, 1 Samuel 31. This is in the battle on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines have critically wounded Saul. And Saul says to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through." It sounds familiar, doesn't it? "Or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. It was an intentional? Yes. Is there a reason? What's the reason? Different from Abimelech. What's the reason? Still, what's fear? There's still an element of pride, but it's also fear. He does not want to be abused, at least not while he's living. So kill me. But he has a reason. Saul's armor bearer, next verse. When the armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. Intentional? Yes. Reason? Yes. Though he's not as certain that he would be abused as a captive, he might be made a slave. But when he saw what Saul did, that provided an example to him that said, "I can do that too." And he did. Ahithophel. When Ahithophel advised Absalom, who was in rebellion against David, but Absalom didn't heed his advice. He followed Hushai's counsel instead. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. Intentional? Clearly. Reason? Why did Ahithophel do it? He was guilty of treason against David, and he also had lost position and power with Absalom. And so for those reasons, he went home, he methodically put his house in order, and then hanged himself. Well, that's interesting. This is for the origin of that phrase, "put your house in order." And I've known people, some suicides are in disarray, but many suicides are very well organized. I mean, they're planned, the plan is carried out, but there was one suicide in particular. It was a bank teller. She went home on her lunch break and never came back to work. She had gone out into the backyard and shot herself. She had a big note prepared that she taped to the garage door saying, "I'm in the backyard." And she had called 911 just before she fired the shot. In fact, the dispatcher heard the shot. When we went into her house, there on the dining room table were stacks of papers for her son and daughter-in-law. All her important papers laid out in order. All of her bank accounts, all of her bills, everything. The house was immaculate. She had gone through and thoroughly cleaned everything. She didn't want any strangers coming into her house and having it, dirty. This is a function of it. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. Zimri. Zimri was a king. We used to have a TV program, Queen for a Day. Zimri was king for a week. Zimri rose up against the king of Israel and killed him and killed all of his family. Word got out. Zimri expected he would be acclaimed, but he was not. The army had no interest in Zimri, and they appointed their general Omri to be the king. And Omri brought the army against Zimri. And when Zimri saw that Tirzah, the city where he was holding court, was taken, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him. So he died because of the sins he had committed, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. Intentional? Yes. Reason? He did not want to be held responsible or accountable for his crimes. That sometimes is a reason why people will take their lives. Judas. Matthew chapter 27, Acts chapter 1. Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. In Acts 1:18, with the reward he got for his wickedness, the 30 shekels, Judas, the 30 pieces of silver, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong. His body burst open and all his intestines spilled out. Putting these together, it sounds like he hanged himself. He wasn't found for quite a while. His body bloated up and burst. And all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language Hakeldama, that is, field of blood. Intentional? Yes. Reason? Seems to be remorse. A remorse that did not lead him to repentance. Paul talks about a godly sorrow that leads us to repentance. This was not a godly sorrow that brought him to God. This was a sorrow over what he had done. The implication seems to be that Judas may have thought that he would sell Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, but then Jesus would do something miraculous, and that there wouldn't be this outcome. But there it was. He felt badly about it, badly enough to take himself out of the picture completely.